Chapter 28, Second Year, Assumptions. The problem with trying to find a solution to his upcoming betrothal was that any time Sirius thought about it, his chest got tight and his throat closed up, and he felt very hot and very cold all at once. It was much easier not to think about it at all, to pretend it wasn't happening, or that it was happening to someone else. In fact, the more Sirius tried to picture it, the more he became sure that he would never be getting married. He couldn't imagine ever wanting to spend the rest of his life cooped up in a house with some girl. So although James had tasked the Marauders with a new mission, they didn't spring into action immediately. Instead, they spent most of the weekend after his birthday indulging Sirius's whims. They listened to Bowie, they explored a new passage that led from a fourth-floor broom cupboard to a painting near the astronomy tower. They dropped ink-spraying quills into unsuspecting students' bags. He knew that his friends were all treading carefully, exchanging worried glances behind his back and treating him a little more gently than usual. But Sirius was perfectly willing to take advantage of the special treatment if it meant that he got his way for a full weekend. Peter didn't even whinge once, and he could always be counted on to complain. Besides, the only way to show his friends that he was fine, and that they didn't have to tiptoe around him, was to act fine. Sirius plastered on a smile and dragged them all into a whirlwind of activity that left them too exhausted on Saturday night to discuss anything having to do with his family. He slept deeply, dreaming that he was choking on platinum blonde hair. It wasn't until Sunday afternoon that his luck began to run out. James was endlessly patient, but Remus and Peter had begun to have enough of doing whatever Sirius said. After lunch he suggested that they test out the time delay spell on the dung bombs. He'd forgotten to leave them in the Slytherin common room, what with everything that had happened. Remus groaned. "I do have homework, you know." They were lying in their dorm room, Ziggy Stardust playing for the 1000th time in the background. Sirius threw a sock at him. "Swat." "Tosser." Peter swallowed, darting a nervous glance at Sirius. "I actually really need to get started on my herbology essay." "Oh, not you too." "I know for a fact that you haven't even started that essay," Remus pointed out. "Why don't we go to the library?" "Does marauding mean nothing to you?" Sirius threw an arm dramatically over his eyes. "Our noble mission trampled beneath the feet of academic drivel." He could feel Remus rolling his eyes from across the room. "I'll help you, Sirius," James said gamely. "You lads can run along to the library if you want." "Are you sure?" "Yeah, go on, Pete. At least one of us has to write the herbology essay. Otherwise, who will the rest of us copy?" So they split up, Remus and Peter heading off to the library, while Sirius and James took the invisibility cloak down to the dungeon. Once there, they ended up splitting up again. The downside to the time delay spell was that they couldn't guarantee there'd be a victim around when it went off, and if they wanted to cover as much ground as possible before James's Quidditch practice in the evening, they couldn't stay together. James suggested that they just leave half the passageways untouched, but Sirius insisted that he'd be sneaky enough to avoid getting caught, even without the invisibility cloak. "Besides," he added, "if someone sees me skulking around, I can just say I came down here to pay a visit to my lovely family, can't I?" It didn't come off quite as light-hearted as he meant it to. His voice was too bitter on the word family. Maybe that's what jinxed it, or maybe his luck just ran out. Either way, Sirius had just finished tucking his last dung bomb behind a torch when he rounded a corner and ran straight into none other than Regulus Black himself. For a moment they just stared at each other. Then, "Where are your friends?" "Where are your friends?" "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing." Regulus huffed. "I'm on my way to my room, obviously." "Right. Reggie belonged here." Sirius didn't. He tried not to let it sting. It still did. "So, why are you down here?" Regulus crossed his arms, waiting for an answer. "I came to see you." It was the first excuse that had popped into his head. Sirius watched his brother's face transform, spite turning to shock, turning to confusion, turning to something guarded, something wary. Since when does he look at me like that? There was a pause, then, "Why?" He grinned, affecting nonchalance. "What, do I need a reason to talk to my brother?" The words had a strange effect on Reggie. He seemed to droop a little, become smaller. "I thought you were mad at me," he said, still somewhat guarded, scuffing one foot against the stone floor. Sirius shrugged. "I am, sort of. You're mad at me too." "Yeah, sort of." More silence. It was incredible how difficult it was to speak to each other. Reggie used to be the only person in the world he could talk to. Now it felt like all their words slid past each other, never really touching. Finally, Sirius spoke. His voice was quiet, even though there was no one around to hear them. "Why didn't you tell me?" It was like pulling teeth saying it, but Sirius had to. He was glad that Reg didn't ask what he was talking about, because he wasn't sure that he knew himself. "Why didn't you tell me about the wedding? About wanting to be in Slytherin? About the scars? Why did you stop talking to me?" Regulus smiled a small, unhappy smile. Would it have made a difference? Sirius didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. James had to leave for Quidditch practice, so Sirius found himself in the common room. He listened to Bowie again, but it didn't make him feel any better. Eventually, he turned off the record and went to the library to find his friends. Being alone with his thoughts left him too vulnerable. He felt as though he'd been trying his best to hold the door shut while someone banged on the other side. As long as he'd had people around him, helping him, distracting him, he'd been able to manage. But when he was alone, everything he'd shut away threatened to spill back out. Peter was still in the library, working on his herbology essay, but Remus was gone, down to the dungeons to check on his potion. Sirius didn't want to hang out alone with Peter. He was already in a darkening mood, and the small boy tended to grate on his nerves even more when there was no one to act as a buffer between them. Sirius didn't entirely trust himself to be civil. Even the way Peter was holding his quill annoyed him at the moment. He couldn't stay in the library, and he couldn't go back to the dungeons, so Sirius ended up back in the common room, feeling very sorry for himself as he lay on the floor with a book. It was something he'd brought from home, full of nasty hexes. As he read each one, he imagined using them on some nebulous enemy. Sometimes Snape, sometimes Mulciber, sometimes his mother, his family, his brother. This only served to worsen his mood, and by the time James returned from practice, Sirius didn't want to do anything but sulk. James tried to strike up a conversation, but he was still in his Quidditch robes, which didn't improve Sirius's mood. Sensing his friend's agitation, James eventually quieted, seemingly deciding that it was best to let him sulk in peace. He settled onto one of the sofas, flicking Zonko's bursting beans into the fireplace and watching them burst into colourful miniature explosions. Remus found them like this when he returned through the portrait hole, side by side with Lily Evans. "All right, Lupin?" James grinned, raising his eyebrows a bit. Sirius frowned. Since when did Remus hang out with Evans? He nodded to the ginger girl before joining his friends, and she gave him a smile and a wave. "Dumped us for Evans, have you?" James asked, smirking. "Potions," Remus replied. "Right. You friends with her now?" "Sort of," Remus shrugged. "She's all right. Hates you two." This got Sirius's attention. He sat up, affronted, as James exclaimed, "What? But everyone likes us. We're lovable rogues." "She thinks you're show-offs." James gasped dramatically. "How dare she? We'll have to win her over." "Why bother?" Sirius rolled over, going back to his book. "She's friends with Snivellus. She clearly has no taste." He didn't honestly care much either way, but James seemed to. He asked, "Did she really say that?" "She said you think you're God's gift," Remus responded, sounding amused. "What does that mean?" "It's a Muggle expression. It means she thinks you're full of yourself." James considered this for a second. "She thinks that?" "Well," Sirius could hear the smirk in Remus's voice, "you sort of are, to be honest." James laughed at that, and Remus sat down next to him. He grabbed a handful of Zonko's beans and started flinging them too, and pretty soon they'd made a game of it, trying to see who could create the biggest explosion by hitting the embers just right. Once they ran out of beans, James cleared his throat. "Forgot to say," he said casually. "Got the owl from Dad today. He's spoken to McGonagall and got permission for us to have you over Christmas." "What? Really?" Remus sounded astonished. Sirius frowned down at his book, where he'd reread the same sentence 4 times. He didn't want to think about Christmas right now. "Yeah, doesn't think he could get you for summer, though. Sorry." Remus made an incredulous noise in the back of his throat, and when Sirius looked up, he was staring at James like the boy had saved his life. It made something twist in Sirius's chest. "Just waiting for you now, mate." James nudged Sirius with his foot. "Have you sorted it out with your mum? Say you're going to the Pettigrews again." "Not bothering," Sirius said, turning back to his book. "Just going to go to yours without saying anything." He could feel in the pause that followed that his friends were worrying about him. It only served to irritate him further. There was no way he was going to abandon his dignity and plead with his family for the right to spend time with his mates. In fact, he didn't want to speak to his mother ever again. "Mum won't like it," James said hesitantly. "Don't tell her then." Sirius turned his page, even though he'd hardly processed a single word. He was going to have to go back and reread later if he really wanted to learn how to curse someone so that their food tasted like toad spit. His friend's nervous energy was still palpable from where they sat above him. Sirius dug his nails into the binding of the book. "I'm fine," he insisted to himself, as if thinking it hard enough could somehow transmit the thought outside his body and make it true.